confuse you for me. I think we'll get this event started. My name's Desmond Lochman, and I'm a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to what I hope is going to be a lively Brexit event. When Freddie Gray of the London Spectator and I first planned this event some 2 months ago, we deliberately chose March 27th as the day to hold our seminar. After all, it was 2 days before the scheduled March 29th end date of the 2-year Brexit negotiating period under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. We did so with the idea that by then we would have clarity on the type of Brexit deal that the UK would have obtained from Europe. That would have allowed us to have a post-mortem of those negotiations and a discussion of what happens next. It would be an understatement to say that this has proved to be too far an optimistic assessment of what would occur, and today the likely outcome of Brexit is less clear than ever. Brussels has now agreed to delay Brexit to May the 22nd if Mrs. May can secure parliamentary support for her deal by April the 12th. If Mrs. May's deal is rejected for a third time, and it seems this afternoon there's doubt as to whether the Speaker is going to allow it to be voted for a third time, the UK will have until April the 12th to set out its next steps, with a longer extension on offer from Europe only if Britain takes part in the European parliamentary elections scheduled for the end of May. Failing that, the UK could crash out of Europe without a deal on April the 12th. So effectively what's occurred is the cliff has been just pushed back a couple of weeks. In the meantime, UK politics have become increasingly unsettled. I keep going in for understatements, with Parliament seeming to have wrested control from Theresa May of the parliamentary agenda. It has done so by agreeing to hold a series of indicative votes today on a variety of alternative Brexit proposals. The net upshot is that even at this late hour, 5 minutes to midnight, we do not know how these negotiations will end. Will Mrs. May finally get approval for her deal? Will the UK make a clean break from Europe without a deal on April the 12th? Will the UK be given a long extension by its European partners to hold a second referendum or general election? Will the UK revoke Article 50 and remain in Europe after all? This is what remains to be seen. Now, for many of us who have been following Brexit for some time, the term Brexit seems to be a misnomer. Brexiternity might have been a more apt way of describing what seems to be a never-ending negotiating process. Even worse, there's some bad news with which we all will have to cope. Even once we get past this stage of the Brexit negotiations, which was supposed to be the easy part of the negotiation, we'll have another lengthy process of at least 2 years during which the United Kingdom will be negotiating as permanent trade agreement with Europe, and most likely it'll be negotiating with itself as well. I'm delighted that I was able to persuade a strong and diverse panel of experts as I've managed to assemble here to help us understand the issues at stake. Not only are we fortunate to have 2 leading European scholars from the Peterson Institute and Brookings to guide us through the Brexit morass, we also have the Irish Ambassador and the UK Trade Commissioner for North America to provide us with their perspectives on this issue. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Freddie Gray, who will introduce the speakers and moderate what I hope will be a lively and informative session.
Thank you, Desmond. Hello, I'm Freddie Gray. I'm the deputy editor of The Spectator. And for the last 6 months, I've been here in Washington launching Spectator USA, which is our American edition. And I hoped that that would mean I was blissfully removed from the horror that is Brexit. But sadly, that hasn't quite panned out that way. But I'm always quite touched that Americans often ask about Brexit or that Brexit thing. And they seem genuinely quite concerned, as if they were asking about a dead relative or something like that. But I mean, the problem is I don't really know how to answer them except to say really very badly. And luckily, we have a panel that will answer much better than I can. Our first speaker is Anthony Phillipson, who was announced as Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America in February 2018. He joined the civil service in 1993 and has held a large number of posts in Her Majesty's government. He has a degree in modern history from Oxford. And let's hear what he has to say.
Be here, and thank you very much for the invite. The question that I sort of had in my mind when I was thinking about what to say today was the one on the topic for the seminar, which is, does Brexit matter? To which I think I would say an unequivocal yes. How it matters, why it matters, and what you want to see come out of it, I think then depends on where you are. Let me just say a couple of sort of headline words maybe for a minute. I mean, I'm certainly not going to say anything as po-faced as that I'm off the record, because I'm not. This is an extraordinary dynamic process. I've been in the civil service for over 25 years. I've been lucky enough to work at the centre. I've been lucky enough to work on big topics like Iran, including the Northern Ireland peace process. I've had a very enjoyable career. We have never, in my view, seen a process like Brexit. In terms of the constitutional challenge that it poses, the political challenge that we see playing out in front of you. I don't see any point in pretending that it is anything other than a very, very fluid constitutional, political, societal and economic moment. And given the extraordinary media world that we live in, it is playing out in front of us in real time. I went to see Network on Broadway the other day, and it rather feels like we're sort of in that sort of moment. It's all coming in at us. And I'm not going to check my phone every 5 minutes during the next 2 hours, but I kind of feel like I ought to, because as we sit here, the House of Commons is debating in its latest iteration what Brexit is going to mean and how it is going to be delivered. And I guess for completeness, if it's going to be delivered. It is an extraordinary day on the constitutional side of this. The government resisted but lost on an amendment earlier this week that allowed effectively the House of Commons itself to take control of business today. And so what is happening in the House of Commons is they are debating and will then vote on at about 3 o'clock our time a series of what's called indicative votes. And the reason we've ended up here, and I'm not going to go through the whole sort of history of this, is because over the last few months, dating back, I would say, I think the key date on this is maybe November the 25th, which was the moment that the Prime Minister and her government reached an agreement with the European Council. We had been negotiating with the Commission, who were negotiating on behalf of the Council since the 29th of March 2017. 25th of November last year, the Prime Minister and the EU agreed a withdrawal agreement that was a long, very detailed legal text that described how the UK would remove itself from the European Union. It covered key issues like the financial settlement that we'd make to settle our obligations that we had committed to as members. It covered what we were going to do about the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens across the EU. I think it actually covers EEA, I should be more specific. It also covered an absolutely crucial issue for both the UK government and, although I'm not going to speak for Daniel, the Irish government, which is how do we protect the gains made during the Northern Ireland peace process. That is a fundamental priority for both the UK, Irish and EU negotiating teams. So the withdrawal agreement, as I say, explained how we were going to do a smooth and orderly withdrawal. It had in it provision for something called an implementation period that would last from the 29th of March 2019, Friday this week, through until the end of December 2020, during which the UK and the EU would move into the next phase of negotiation to complete the detail around a future partnership. And the reason we were doing that is because both the Prime Minister and the UK government and also the EU had always made clear from the very beginning of this process that although the UK was leaving the EU, we were not leaving Europe. We were not giving up on our historic and political and economic and security interests looking forward to European prosperity and security. We want a close future relationship with the EU, and we believe that the EU wants a close future relationship with us. The question was always, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And that where we want to be was set out in a much shorter political declaration. It was only, I think, about 28 pages. But it wasn't just the UK government asserting what the future was going to look like. It was a shared set of ambitions between the UK and the EU. And it talked, as I say, about our future economic and security relationship. The problem is that in the period since the 25th of November, it actually became quite clear quite soon, I think after the 25th of November, that the first thing that needed to happen, which was the UK Parliament, the House of Commons, agreeing that withdrawal agreement, including the implementation period, and also the political declaration, they weren't going to do so. The numbers just weren't there. And over the last few months, what we have seen is both in January and then again a few weeks ago, two what have been called meaningful votes, meaningful vote 1, meaningful vote 2. And the first one, the government lost, and not by a small amount. They lost by 230 votes. In the second meaningful vote, after that first meaningful vote, the government returned to Europe, returned to Brussels, and more negotiation with the Commission, and secured two documents that effectively addressed one of the sources of concern, which was what had come by then to be known as the Irish backstop. What the backstop is was a provision within the withdrawal agreement that made clear that if we got to the end of the implementation period and we hadn't completed the negotiation on the future partnership, so we were not ready to move into a future partnership as a result of which we could keep the border completely open in Ireland, then we would enter a backstop as a sort of insurance policy that would last until we were able to agree those alternative arrangements within the future partnership. And the reason that was in there was both a requirement on behalf of the EU negotiating position, but also it was something that the UK government had agreed to in a political declaration in December 2017. So we had agreed to it and we made it manifest in the withdrawal agreement, but it became clear that that was a source of significant opposition within the UK Parliament. It wasn't the only one. There were also concerns about whether the relationship that we were going to end up with the EU was too close. It would essentially leave us as rule takers. It would limit our ability to conduct an independent trade policy, including with countries like America. For others, it was a reflection that it's not close enough and that they would actually prefer that we didn't leave. And for others, they just thought we should leave without a deal. We should just bring down the shutters and off we go. And the point I would keep coming back to is that the Prime Minister has been absolutely consistent, in my view, ever since the speech she made in January 2017 at Lancaster House in London, that she did not want to leave without a deal. We wanted to leave in a way that was smooth and orderly. We wanted to do so in a way that ensured we didn't endanger the gains made under the peace process in Ireland, that we could conduct an independent trade policy, that we could provide certainty for business through the implementation period, etc. And that is what we have been trying to do ever since. The reason we've ended up in this constitutional moment today, with Parliament effectively taking back control, is it became obvious that Parliament, every time it was going to be asked, what do you want, couldn't come up with the answer. What it could come up with was both rejecting the withdrawal agreement and the meaningful vote, but also, a couple of times, has voted against no deal. The problem with that is that while I think it's important and hugely significant that Parliament voted against no deal, until Parliament agrees something else, or until the Parliament agrees something that the government has put to it and agrees something else, no deal is what happens, because that's the result of the way that Article 50 operates. A 2-year process, March 29th, 2017 to 2019. So, we will see what comes out of those votes. I can't tell you what's going to come out of those votes. I would happily speculate wildly and think aloud in front of you, but let's not do that maybe until we get into questions. And we will see what happens today. The other significant thing that has happened at the European Council last week is that the date, March the 29th, as a sort of cliff edge, has moved. And it will now either be April the 12th, actually no, let me put it more positively. It will either be May the 22nd, if Parliament agrees the withdrawal agreement this week, in which case the EU has agreed that they will push out that end date until May the 22nd in order to give us time to turn that meaningful vote actually into legislation. If the meaningful vote is not passed this week, then the EU has made clear that the new end date is the 12th of April, by which time either we need to agree that we're leaving without a deal, or we need to come back to the EU with an alternative plan. And that's what Parliament is literally live today, now, debating. So that's the process. It's incredibly complex. It's incredibly detailed. It has been a very hard negotiation. The Prime Minister, I think, said from the very beginning it was going to be a hard negotiation. We always had our position. The EU always had its position. The Prime Minister, I think, were she sitting here, would still say she believes that the deal that she reached with the EU is the best that could be reached in terms of smooth and orderly withdrawal, future trade policy ambitions, not endangering, for example, existing relationships and massive amounts of investment from America, for example, and protecting the border in Ireland. So, very, very quickly, does Brexit matter? Yes, of course it does. But I think it depends on who you ask and where they are as to why it matters and what they want to see us do about it. I think it matters to the UK people, especially those who voted to leave. They want to see Brexit, and the Prime Minister is committed to try and make that manifest. But there's obviously a very live debate. Some of you, I'm sure, will have seen the pictures of the march in London at the weekend, or maybe even stories about the petition. And they will have also seen people expressing concern that if we don't leave, what does that mean for our commitment to democratic principles? We asked a question, the British people gave a clear answer, so we should do it. And that's playing out in front of us. To the EU, I think it does matter to the EU. I think there are still some, again, I wouldn't speak for them, who would rather that we weren't leaving. There are others who think, okay, you've made your decision to leave, now we just need to make sure it happens in a way that doesn't sort of endanger key EU principles, including the sanctity of the single market and the four freedoms, for example. And I think the other thing I would observe, but I will leave Dan to comment if he wishes, that the EU has some other things that we're quite likely to be spending its time thinking about at the minute. And so, Brexit is just another thing to be thinking about in an already quite complicated world. So I think it matters to them, and they'd quite like to see it handled in an orderly way, and that's what we're trying to do. Last, but very much not least, in terms of my day job, does it matter to the US? Again, I think it depends where you are. I sit in New York, and I talk to financial services firms or life sciences firms, and it matters fundamentally. And so we explain how we're trying to sort of make this happen in a way that doesn't needlessly disrupt their investment. The UK-US trade relationship is extraordinarily deep. The US, in terms of single countries, is our single biggest export partner. We are the biggest investors in each other's country. That is not all because of our membership of the EU since the mid-1970s, but for many of them it is a significant factor. And so we want to take account of that. But it's not the only thing. I was talking to someone just now before I came down who lives in Las Vegas, and I said I was going off to do a talk about does Brexit matter, and he looked at me and said, no, it doesn't matter to me in Las Vegas, which, maybe that's the answer. Let's all go to move to Vegas. I didn't ask him whether he gambled. So I think it's a very dynamic, fluid process. Final thought I would just say is that I try to set out, at least, that Brexit isn't the only thing we should be talking about when people are engaging with the UK government. Yes, I know it matters, and as I say, I believe it matters for all the reasons I've set out. But it's part of a bigger conversation that we ought to be having about Britain's role in the world. It's part of a bigger conversation that we ought to be having about the challenges that we face in the world and how we should be working together. I remain absolutely confident that the UK and the EU will be working together in the future on issues like climate change, on counter-terrorism, on peace in the Middle East, on the big issues that are coming at us in terms of the future economy around AI and digital trade and tech, etc., etc. I also believe that we will still be working very closely with the Americans, with the American administration, federal government, state legislatures, etc., with the business community, and everyone else that matters to this most extraordinary relationship that we have developed with them and that we intend to keep developing for the future. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's the smoothest representation of the British position I've heard so far. Well done. And can we move from the British position to the Irish position? Our next speaker is Daniel Mulhall, who has been Ireland's ambassador to the United States since August 2017. Before that, he was Ireland's ambassador to London, and before that, Malaysia. He's also a keen historian and writer, the author of A New Day Dawning, A Portrait of Ireland in 1900, and co-editor of The Shaping of Modern Ireland, a Centenary Assessment. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just to answer the question, does Brexit matter? Well, it matters a hell of a lot to Ireland. We're probably the country, other than Britain, of course, other than the UK, to which it matters most of all of the European Union member states. It matters to our government because it's a major challenge for our government. It's taken up an enormous amount of time and energy and political commitment over the last since the referendum, really, because our ministers, our government has been very active in travelling around Europe to make sure that all of our European Union partners understand precisely the concerns that Ireland has. It matters to Irish people because most Irish people have links of one kind or another with the UK, be it having family who live there, and there are 700,000 Irish-born people who live in Britain today, and there are several millions of people who are descended from Irish people who went there over the generations past. So that people-to-people dimension is very strong between Britain and Ireland, always has been, despite times when there were political difficulties. That dimension has always been strong and will continue to be strong. And one of the good things that's come out of the Brexit discussions is that the British government has confirmed that the common travel area between Britain and Ireland will continue come what may. So even if there's a no-deal Brexit, which would be a very bad outcome for everyone, but even in those circumstances, the right of British people or Irish people to travel to Britain without any controls, to live and work in Britain and so forth, and the reciprocal rights available to British citizens in Ireland will continue, come what may. So that's the second reason. It matters to our businesses because while the United States is our number one trading partner and the number one source of investment into Ireland, the UK is a close second. And for example, if you look at Irish-owned businesses, say in the food sector where our indigenous companies are very strong, about 40% of exports from Irish-owned companies go to Britain, which means that any disruption to that trading link would be economically damaging from an Irish point of view. It obviously matters very much to Irish people who live on or near the border with Northern Ireland, because any change to the status of the border will have an immediate effect on those who travel across the border on a daily basis to work, to visit family, to do business and so forth. There are tens of thousands of people from our part of Ireland that work in Northern Ireland, and likewise there are many people from Northern Ireland that work in for example, I know Primerica employs 1,500 people in Donegal, just across the border from Derry, and I think about a third of their workforce comes from Derry. So if there was any disruption along that border, it would be very costly from the point of view of people like that who require to cross that border on a daily basis for various purposes. And then, of course, it's very important to Northern Ireland as a whole, where, and we cannot be indifferent, we have to have a deep concern what happens in Northern Ireland. And undoubtedly, Brexit has shaken things up in Northern Ireland and has contributed an additional degree of uncertainty to an already fragile political situation that prevails in Northern Ireland. So let me just give you some background to all of this. The reason why Ireland is so concerned about Brexit is because of our experience of the past 45 years of EU membership. And for Ireland, EU membership has been transformative in terms of our economy. When we joined in 1973, we were by far the least developed country in the then 9-member European Economic Community. Today, we're one of the more successful and prosperous countries in the 28-member union we have today. So we have gone from being way behind our EU partners in economic terms to now having caught up with all of them and having moved ahead of many. And it's also, of course, been a period of social change, because our involvement in the European Union has had an impact beyond the economic realm, and it has resulted in great transformations, social changes in Irish society, and also the political engagement that we have been able to have with our European neighbours over the last 45 years has been beneficial from an Irish point of view. When I was in London for the 4 years before I came here, I came to realise that the impact of EU membership had been vital in another area, aside from the economic and political and social changes it had brought about in Ireland. It had also greatly improved Irish-UK relations. And in fact, in the time that I was there, I would hazard a guess, an educated guess, that it was probably the best time in British-Irish relations there'd ever been. And that's because for 45 years we had worked together around those tables in Brussels and Luxembourg and elsewhere around the European Union. And the British and Irish delegations often found themselves seeing eye to eye, because historically perhaps we might be seen as having had an adversarial relationship with the UK, but in a European context, very often the similarities between our two societies and the affinities between us came to the fore. And for example, I have been attending European Union meetings now since 1979. That's how old I am. And every time I attended an EU meeting over those 40-something years, 40 years, at every meeting I attended, there was always a British delegation in the room. And every one of my colleagues in the Foreign Service and in all of our ministries in the government in Dublin have had the experience of going to EU meetings for 4 decades now and cooperating with their British counterparts. And that's built up a certain understanding between us, which is precious, and which I think contributed to a better atmosphere between our two countries and our two governments and our two sets of officials, which has enabled us to make the progress that was made in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement. So we did not want Brexit to take place because we feared it would have a negative impact on the European Union, because I have to be quite frank and say that the European Union for us without Britain will be a less attractive place, because we won't have a country as a fellow member that has very similar sets of views to our own on issues to do with trade and regulation and innovation and the encouragement of foreign investment and so forth. So in terms of the policy profile of the Irish government, the economic policy profile will be very similar to the one that the UK has. And therefore, we will miss the influence of a large member state like the UK around the table in Brussels and Luxembourg in the years ahead. We also feared the impact on Irish-UK relations, which, as I say, had benefited enormously from our membership together of the European Union. Now, I don't take an alarmist view of this. I don't believe that our relations are going to plummet because of Brexit. I think we'll go back to having a very close relationship, come what may, because, of course, we are neighbours and we have so much in common and so much to do together that it would be irresponsible for either of our countries to not work together very closely. But it will require a bigger effort in the future, because we'll no longer have the framework of EU membership within which to operate. And we also fear the impact on Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. But we, of course, accept that Britain and every other member state has a perfect right to leave the European Union. And that's the nature of the Union. It is not like the Union here, where it's not possible to leave the Union, as far as I know, without a struggle. But that's not the case with European, because the European Union is a free association of its member states, and each of them has the sovereign right to do as they choose with regard to their EU membership. So our concern has simply been to minimise the impact of Brexit on Ireland, on the European Union. We don't want to see the European Union that we're committed to membership of being damaged by Brexit. We want to see Irish-UK relations preserved. We want to see those thrive and prosper in the future. And we are determined to avoid any negative impact on Northern Ireland. And in that, the British government shares the view that the Irish government has, that nothing can be done in the Brexit context that would damage the Northern Ireland peace process. And our EU partners have worked closely with us over the last 3 years and have listened to our concerns, and they've been very strongly supportive of Ireland's concerns. And, of course, the negotiations, we don't negotiate with Britain. The negotiations are done by the European Commission on behalf of the European Union with Ireland as a member, with Ireland as a very interested member, I have to say. But nonetheless, we're not negotiating directly with the UK. That's being done by Michel Barnier and his team in the Commission. So no one wants a border on the island of Ireland, and that's the key political problem. The difficulty is that no one quite knows how to achieve an open border if the UK leaves the single market and the customs union. And that's why the backstop becomes so important. And that backstop, remember, originally was only intended to cover Northern Ireland. But at the request of the British government, the EU agreed to extend it to cover the whole of the UK. So the UK now has a backstop included in the withdrawal agreement. And that, as Anthony has said, has created political difficulties in the UK. So my final point would be that nobody wants Britain to leave the European Union without a deal. It would be disastrous all round, including for Ireland. And we're glad that the British Parliament has ruled out that option, though I recognise the fact that this is not a legal reality, it's a political one, but that would certainly be one that we would very much share. We have to wait and see what happens at Westminster, but our government has made it clear they want to give the UK every opportunity to arrange its departure from the European Union in an organised and orderly manner. Key point is that we're staying in the European Union. The Irish public, the recent opinion polls have shown a 90% level of support for EU membership in Ireland. The support for membership has actually gone up in the light of Brexit, because I think people have seen the effects of Brexit. They've seen how complicated leaving the EU actually is. Although you're free to do it, it's complicated to do so if you want to retain the benefits. And we hope that Ireland can, in the context of Britain leaving the EU, when we become the only English-speaking country in the European Union, that we can be more of a bridge between the European Union and the United States, that we will become more attractive to US companies looking for a base within the European Union. But we will also want to ensure that Britain stays as closely tied to the European Union as possible, because that is the best way to minimise disruption to Irish-UK relations and to preserve the precious gains of the Northern Ireland peace process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm not getting the impression that Brexit doesn't matter so far. But Arthur Balfour, the British Prime Minister, said nothing matters very much and few things matter at all. But perhaps Brexit is one of those few things. Our next speaker is Adam Posen. Adam Posen has been president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics since January 2013. He was formally appointed by the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer to serve a 3-year term as an external voting member on the Bank of England's Rate-Setting Monetary Policy Committee. And he's also consulted for the UK Cabinet Office for the successful London G20 summit of 2009 during the global financial crisis. Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you looking up from your phones, however briefly, and I will not hold it against you if you look down again. And my thanks as well to Desmond. He kindly invited me back. We had a panel here on Brexit at AEI, about 20 months ago? And I think I'm the only one who got invited back besides Desmond, so thank you. My brief, as I understand it, is to give you a bit of an economic baseline, as the two senior diplomats to my right have rightly emphasized. This is a political issue, a diplomatic issue, an economic issue, a social issue. Let me give you a bit of an economic baseline and then link it to some of these political points. I think the place to start, which is where I started 20 months ago, is that the UK had for several years this sort of half-in, half-out relationship with the EU. Legally, formally, they were part of the EU, of course, a full member, but in economic terms, they had opt-outs of some of the most important integration measures. They had opt-outs of Schengen, which was the agreement about border control and movement of people. They had a delay compared to some other countries in terms of the admission of poor Eastern European workers into the UK. They famously did not sign up to be part of the euro and were not required, as opposed to many others. And in a sense, this was the best of all worlds for the EU and the UK, because the UK did have, in its political class, if nowhere else, a fundamental skepticism towards some of the European integration efforts, while Europe inherently, legally, is committed to an ever closer union. And so there was this fundamental tension. Now, some people, including some of the people I appeared on the panel with 20 months ago in this building, make that out to be a very deep ideological divide, and that the UK is the savior of Nordic, Hanseatic, Milton Friedman-esque, onwards Christian soldiers, right thinking, and Brussels is what would happen if Mike Dukakis had been elected president, and is this extreme form of overregulation and imperial centralization, and therefore it's morally just and right that the UK leaves, and the US, the right-thinking people in the US should cheer this. The person who most articulated that view is now the National Security Advisor of the United States, John Bolton. I think that's a fundamentally wrong view for a variety of reasons, but I also think most fundamentally it vastly exaggerates the extent of division between UK and EU on at least economic matters. So what actually happens if we start thinking about Brexit? Brexit, to put it simply, is the UK declaring a trade war on itself. It is saying we are going to put up as many barriers as possible, subject to internal political resistance and the human Irish issue, to our trade with our closest trading partner. And we're going to do so in a manner that actually is worse for the UK, which is fundamentally a high-end service exporting economy and service specialized economy, not just the City of London in terms of financial services, but business services, consulting on how you run oil rigs, accounting, even film, all these ways in which Tony Blair used to talk about cool Britannia. It was an exporter of cultural and business services. And if we secede from the EU, we not only have tariffs on goods, but we are no longer part of the rules setting that surrounds services trade, standards for various business services, the financial relationships, the internal market, which is much more than not having tariffs. And so this is likely not to be easily replaced or adjusted to by the UK. As I've put it before, one of the few things in economics that we actually know is true, in the sense that it both is very robustly shown in the data and very robust makes sense, is what's called the gravity model of trade. That the bulk of your trade tends to be with countries that are geographically near to you and with whom you have historical relationships. And this is why Irish-UK trade is such an incredibly high multiple of trade with anybody else, for example. And so we can talk about, as Her Majesty's representative did, the idea that the US is the single largest trading partner as a single country with the UK, which is true, but in reality, the EU trade with the UK is somewhere between 2 and 3 times the trade with the US. And this is not going to change overnight. This is a fundamental thing due to gravity you're not going to be able to shift. As David Cameron, the erstwhile Prime Minister, said while I was serving at the Bank of England at that time, the UK did more trade with Ireland than it did with the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That has now been changed. China does a tiny bit more trade with the UK than Ireland does. So if that doesn't give you a sense of the power of geography, of history, and the inability of the UK, or for that matter, any country, to just turn on a dime, it should. So ultimately, to me, the way this gets felt and the way this becomes visible is through investment. And so at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, we've done a lot of work over the last year, for perhaps obvious reasons, trying to think through and trying to analyze, when you have a trade conflict whether it's one the UK is doing to itself or whether it's one like President Trump is initiating with some other countries. What are the real big effects? What are their big effects? What are the effects on employment? What are the effects on growth? Not just on soybeans or on certain cars. And what you find, and this is not just us, this is general in the economics literature, what you find is the actual direct trade effects are meaningful but pretty small. They don't add up to a lot unless you're a very small economy. And the UK is small, but not that small. But the investment effects are very large. And the investment effects are very large for a couple reasons. The first is that investment is forward-looking, and it tends to not like uncertainty, and it tends to care a lot about what's the future path. And so when you have the kind of situation that's been very aptly described here about decision-making in Britain and the extended process of the UK leaving the EU and the indeterminacy beyond the withdrawal agreement, even if meaningful vote number 3 passes, it's deterring to investment. It's also deterring to investment because you make investment based on relative advantages. You heard Ambassador Mulhall talk about the idea that in a post-UK EU, Ireland might, as the one English-speaking, everybody speaks English there, I'm afraid, but the one native English-speaking, let us say, country in the EU with great rule of law and familiarity to Americans and so on, that it will become a magnet, it will become a platform for people who want to maintain headquarters or exports into the EU. And of course, some UK trade will be lost and some UK investment, more importantly, will be lost because of that. The representative spoke about the fact quite realistically that the UK government, for right and wrong, wants to reassure long-term multinational investors in the UK, and the US investment in the UK is huge, and only some of it is motivated by the idea that this was the friendliest place in various senses to invest and still be in Europe, but some of it indeed was. And we can see this in the fact that the auto industry in the UK, which has no reason to really exist given the few number of drivers in the UK and given that they produce stuff on where they drive on the wrong side of the car, let alone the road, that it was outsized because it was a place from which to export into the EU. And various automakers, Toyota, Nissan, Jaguar Land Rover, Ford, have made statements of varying degrees to saying, well, we're not going to invest any more in this plant, or Toyota just announced they're going to start producing a much cheaper, lower-end car in a plant they otherwise would have closed. And just inherently, the future investment, the future of this industry in the UK is gone. Now, employment in the auto sector in the UK is not the be-all and end-all, but it's just illustrative of what's going on. And so when you start adding all this up, we published just recently a academic survey, a clear survey of all the various estimates of damage to be done to the UK economy. It's available on our website, piae.com. And essentially, we get similar results to other mainstream economists, that if you do Brexit, depending on the form of the Brexit, the UK will lose somewhere between 5 and 10% of GDP over the next 5 years versus what it already otherwise would have had. You can argue that's probably a little bit of an overestimate. It might take 10 years. You can argue it's an underestimate because we have no way of modeling what happens if the pound falls or the disruption of global supply chains. It seems like a reasonable estimate since over the last 2 years, the UK arguably, according to all analyses, including my former colleagues at the Bank of England, lost more than 2% of GDP growth over the last 2 years because of the threat of Brexit and the turmoil around Brexit. So these are real cash. This is real money. Again, is it the end of Britain? No, but it's real money. So where does this leave us? First, about where Brexit comes out, and then does it matter? In terms of where Brexit comes out, I end up being, admittedly, with some tremulousness as a forecaster, given all that's going on, essentially where I started a couple of years ago when Brexit was first announced, that it's all or nothing, that you either have hard Brexit, perhaps not without a withdrawal agreement, but meaning a Brexit in which you're not a member of the single market, you're not a member of the customs union, you're really out in economic terms, Or you have what is now going by the name of Norway Plus or Norway Plus Plus. You are like, roughly, Norway or Switzerland, in which, in economic terms, you're effectively a member of the EU, but you've given up all political say. So you pay money in and you accept their rules and you're part of the economic mechanism, but you no longer have a seat at the table. And the reason I've thought it has to be one of these two things is because anything in between is not a stable equilibrium in economic speak. That if you're somewhere in between, the dissatisfaction of the people who are frustrated is there. You get most of the economic costs anyways, unless you go almost all the way to Norway. And so it's unlikely, and the EU doesn't have an interest in being very accommodating. I mean, in some spiritual, political sense, they do. But from an economic perspective, there's a limit to what they're going to be able to do. So I am hopeful for the economic outcome that would be best for the British people and best for the world. I am hopeful for Norway Plus, and that seems to be one of the indicative votes, or in various forms, a couple of the indicative votes that are being taken today in the Parliament. I am hopeful that if there is an indicative vote by Parliament and some majority for that, that Her Majesty's government will support it. I think, frankly, in some ways, it is actually the closest to the referendum result. Because the referendum result, yes, one can say, okay, the people voted by a 4% gap in the electorate, 52 to 48, for Brexit. Brexit wasn't defined. There's issues about democratic interference, Russian bots, and so on. But ultimately, if you poll people and you ask them, it seems to be, we want Brexit, but Brexit doesn't really cost us much. And so that is Norway Plus, because Norway Plus allows you to pick the color of your passport. Norway Plus allows you to remove all those fancy blue flags with gold stars that are the EU flags. Allows you to get your government out of going to meetings and having to be represented in the European Parliament. It allows you to have a separate foreign policy. It removes any question of Europe being part of decisions as to whether or not there's an ever closer Europe. But you maintain economic union as best as possible. And so to me, if the Parliament in its wisdom is really trying to follow the Brexit mandate and the good of the UK people, that's where they'll end up. But I don't know. Finally, does it matter? Sadly, not that much. I mean, that ultimately, it's not Venezuela. So the British people will suffer, but they will not suffer horrendously. It's not China. So if the UK has an economic problem, it doesn't present that big an economic problem for anybody else. Does it change the balance of discussion with respect to market issues and foreign policy in Europe? Somewhat. Again, I think people have over-exaggerated through the years the extent of distance between the UK position and many, say, the median Brussels position. So somewhat, not hugely. And remember, the UK was already absenting itself from Euro area discussions, from various discussions that were taking place in Europe, even as a member. I think to finally get beyond the economic or into the political economy, the final way in which I think it matters is, sadly, since much of the motivation for Brexit seems to have been similar to the motivation for the extreme right-wing parties in Hungary and Poland, the Five Star Movement and the Liga in Italy, the Trump movement in the US, it is a rural reaction against the cosmopolitan urbanites. It is a white reaction against the people who are not seen as white. And you can see this in the polling data and the election data in the UK, that it is non-London England that votes overwhelmingly for Brexit, and Scots and people of color in the cities vote against. And so it's just very sad to me, because those are values I think are wrong. That's a personal call on my part. But it's just sad to me to see that driving the policy of a once great nation.
Thank you, Adam. If Brexit means the end of cool Britannia, then I'm really become a massively pro-Brexiteer guy.
I think that's already dead, by the way, so that's okay.
Let's banish it forever, please. Our next speaker is Amanda Sloat. Amanda Sloat is a Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Centre on the United States and Europe at Brookings. She is also with the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And she's formerly served in the US government for nearly a decade. Amanda, over to you.
Great, thank you. I want to build on a lot of the comments that were made by the previous speaker and try and answer this question from two perspectives. One is, does it matter in terms of the UK's internal constitutional structures, looking specifically at Scotland, where I lived for 3 years, and Northern Ireland, where I lived for 3 years. And then second, looking at this politically from the perspective of whether or not it matters to the United States and how it does. So picking up on where Adam left off, if you look at the distribution of... Is this really echoey? No?
It's forceful. It's good.
Okay. Like hearing myself. If you look at the breakdown of votes, as Adam mentioned, the referendum result was 52% to 48%. But if you look at how that broke down, there was a majority in London that voted to stay in the European Union. 62% of people in Scotland voted to stay in, and 55.8% of people in Northern Ireland voted to stay in. So a lot of people have described Brexit as essentially an identity crisis of England. But what this has done is it's raised very serious questions for the constitutional framework within the United Kingdom. And let me take Scotland first and then turn to Northern Ireland. When Brexit first happened, the immediate question that most people had was whether or not this was going to prompt a second independence referendum in Scotland. Tony Blair, as part of Cool Britannia and the rest, introduced a program of devolution where he devolved power from London to the constituent parts of the UK. As part of that, a Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999. It's been led by the Scottish Nationalist Party for the last number of years. In 2014, the Scottish National Party, sanctioned by the UK government, held a referendum on the question of Scottish independence. There was a very clear majority of people at the time that voted against Scottish independence, preferring to remain within the United Kingdom. So once Brexit happened, the initial question, especially given the very large percentage of people in Scotland that preferred to stay within the European Union, was whether or not this was going to prompt a second referendum on Scottish independence. Nicola Sturgeon, who leads the Scottish government, is continuing to talk about a second referendum. I think it will likely happen at some stage, but I think she is also looking at the way the political winds are blowing in Scotland. And there's a couple of things that have happened over the last couple of years that I think make this less of an urgent question at the moment, but still something worth watching. First, there's a significant amount of voter fatigue in Scotland. If you look at the last 3 years, people in Scotland have voted in 2 general elections, 2 referenda, local elections, and Scottish elections. So they're simply tired of voting. So with all this talk about a second Brexit referenda, a second Scottish independence referenda, people are tired of voting. It's also become very clear that referenda do not definitively answer political questions, given that we are talking about a second vote on both the Brexit question and on the Scottish question. Third, it's very clear that divorce is hard. And given how hard it's been to end a union of 40 years, think how much more challenging it's going to be to end a union of 300 years. The other thing that people in Scotland have seen watching the debates in Northern Ireland is that if Scotland leaves the UK, rejoins the European Union, England stays out, there will need to be a hard border of some sort between Scotland and England. It will be less existential than the border in Northern Ireland, but it certainly will be inconvenient to people who, for the last 300 years, have been used to living and working without any sort of border restrictions between the two. What I think is a lot more worrying is Northern Ireland. And for all of the talk about Northern Ireland, talk about the backstop, we don't spend that much time talking about Northern Ireland itself. I moved to Belfast a week before 9/11, 3 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and have seen the tremendous amount of progress that has been made in Northern Ireland in the last 20 years. The beauty of the Good Friday Agreement was that it removed identity politics and it removed the constitutional question from people's daily lives. People that identified as nationalists were able to participate more fully in political, civic, and judicial institutions than they had before. And people that were unionists took comfort in the fact that any sort of constitutional change was going to happen through referendum rather than through violence. And the fact that both the UK and Ireland were members of the European Union meant that remaining borders between the two countries were able to come down. One of the things that Brexit has now done is roiled all of these debates again. People in Northern Ireland talk about everything being orange and green. Identity politics, constitutional politics are beginning to become a central part of life in Northern Ireland again. There was a car bomb in Northern Ireland several weeks ago in the city of Derry. This is the kind of thing that would have made national news in the UK, it would have made national news in the US, largely went unnoticed. Northern Ireland has been without a government for over 2 years. Last July, it actually set a world record for being the place that had gone the longest with no government, surpassing even Belgium. And part of the reason that it's been difficult to reconstitute the government is because of how politicized everything has become. In the last couple days, you've even heard Theresa May talking about whether or not the UK needs to reimpose direct rule on Northern Ireland in order to manage the possible consequences of a no-deal Brexit. Sinn Féin, the political party operating in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, has started to raise questions again about whether you need a border poll, whether or not people should vote on reunification of the island of Ireland. And statistics that have come out in the last couple of months about people's attitudes have been quite striking. 87% of voters in Northern Ireland who supported Brexit have said that the peace process is a price worth paying to deliver on the deal. If you look at numbers of people in terms of support for reunification, they're around 30%, but they raise 10 to 20% if you were to have a hard Brexit with a hard border between the two. So I think in all of the talk about Northern Ireland, it's important to look at what's actually happening on the ground and the extent to which politics there are being destabilized. Theresa May, because of snap elections that she called in June 2017, which ended up being disastrous for her politically because she lost her Conservative majority, ended up leading to her government being propped up by the Democratic Unionist Party, the hardline Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, which is also feeding into all of these conversations about the backstop. And so as a result, that tends to be the only voice from Northern Ireland that we are hearing. But if you look at opinion polls, the majority of people in Northern Ireland are actually quite supportive of the backstop because they're the ones that need to live with the consequences. Second set of issues is turning to how this looks from the United States. The U.S. government has actually not been particularly involved in these Brexit conversations. You might remember President Obama went to London a couple of weeks before the Brexit referendum, made a very strong pitch for U.S. support for a strong UK and a strong European Union. Also said a comment that didn't go over particularly well in some quarters, that the UK would be at the back of the queue in terms of trade negotiations with the United States if Brexit went forward. President Trump has taken a completely different approach. He has called Brexit a good thing. He has called the EU an economic foe. And he has been quite supportive of the idea of this going forward, and has also been quite enthusiastic about the idea of negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. In terms of how all of this matters to the U.S., I've had some people ask me whether Britain is going to matter at all. My argument is yes, of course it's going to. We have a shared language, we have a shared history, we have shared values, and we have shared interests in the world. The UK is going to remain an important military partner in NATO. It's going to retain a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It's a nuclear power. For all of those reasons, it's going to remain important to the United States. The biggest concern that I have for the UK as well as for the European Union is that Brexit is consuming all of the bandwidth in London. The vast majority of civil servants in London have been repurposed to do contingency planning for Brexit, which means nobody has the bandwidth to think about much of anything else. And in a situation where we have a very divided cabinet, where we have ministers resigning with increasing frequency these days, it makes it very difficult for politically sensitive issues to be brought to cabinet, which means that the UK does not have the scope to partner with the US on many other global challenges. And even the European Union is completely distracted by this. Last week, the European Summit was supposed to spend their dinner discussion talking about China, potential economic threats coming from China, and how to respond. That entire session got scrapped for the EU to spend hours and hours coming up with this formulation to allow for delays in Brexit. Turning to trade negotiations, USTR put out its negotiating principles a couple of weeks ago, and I think there's an argument that the U.S. will likely take a fairly predatory approach to trade negotiations with the U.K., given the likely desperation with which the U.K. is going to have to approach these arrangements. The U.K., of course, does not have any trade negotiators. It hasn't needed them for the last 40 years. Trade deals take many, many years to develop. And if you look at what came out of USTR, the U.S. is likely going to insist that the UK be willing to accept our agriculture products, which means that you're going to have all of our wonderful chlorine-washed chicken, which tends to be horrifying to many Brits. And you might have to swallow adjustments on pharmaceutical pricing. So if I come back to loop all of these things together and where I will end, is essentially the economic point that Adam was making, which is the UK has to make a fundamental choice about whether or not it wants to stay aligned in economic and regulatory terms with the European Union, which is what a lot of the hard Brexiteers advocated, or whether or not, to stay more closely aligned, which is what they did not advocate, or whether there's going to be a lot more freedom, which gives the UK the freedom to control its own borders, to control its own economic, its own regulation, and to set its own trade agenda. The problem with Theresa May's negotiating approach is she has created what some analysts in London have called a trilemma. She wants to remove the UK from the customs union and the single market. She wants to protect the border in Northern Ireland. And she wants to have a UK-wide approach. You can have two of those things, but you cannot have all three of those things. And that's why a fundamental decision needs to be made. The more closely aligned the UK stays with the European Union, the less problematic Northern Ireland is because the lesser need for intrusive checks there are. The greater separation there is, the harder it is going to be to have seamless trade with the European Union, but the easier it's going to be to negotiate trade agreements with the US and other countries. So even if we reach agreement on a deal, we're only at the end of the beginning, because this conversation about what the future relationship looks like is going to continue all of these same arguments that have plagued the UK for the 40 years of their membership, the 3 years of these discussions over the withdrawal agreement, and foreseeable future in terms of the future relationship.
Thank you, Amanda. I really like chlorinated chicken. I felt there was a real breach in
coronation chicken?
Anglo-American relations. Our last speaker is from AEI, Desmond Lachman, who you've already been introduced to. Desmond focuses on global macroeconomy, global currency issues, and the multilateral lending agencies. Desmond, over to you.
Yeah, I was hoping I could get these slides to work. I don't know whether there's somebody who could help me here. Pardon? Not sure what I need to do. Pardon?
There you go.
I guess I don't have to make the point that I'm technologically challenged. What I want to do is I want to talk about mainly the economics of Brexit, and I would just start by very much agreeing with Adam that in the world before the referendum, before this Brexit process started, it seems to me that the United Kingdom had the best of both worlds, that it was in the single market, that it had unfettered access to a market of 500 million people on very good terms, yet it wasn't forced to be in the euro. So it didn't have all of the disadvantages of the two. Where I disagree with Adam is that I think that Brexit, from an economic point of view, matters hugely if we have the case of a hard Brexit. That would be an event not simply for the United Kingdom, But I would argue that it would be an event for the global economy, certainly for the European economy, because I think we've got to look at the context in which Brexit is taking place. It's not taking place in a context of a healthy global economy that doesn't have problems with China slowing down or with Europe being troubled. So let me say what I would like to talk about, to substantiate that view. The first part of my remarks, I want to just talk about how the UK economy has performed since the referendum, and I'll argue that it's really very much underperformed as a result of Brexit, the uncertainties involved. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the illusions that the Brexiteers had that seem to have been shattered by experience. Third, I want to talk about the prospects of Europe, of the UK economy in the post-Brexit world. And finally, I just want to talk about the context within which Brexit is occurring. So if you look at the performance since the Brexit referendum, what you see, this chart illustrates that the United Kingdom, which is the red line, has gone from being the best performer within the G7 to the weakest performer. And official projections right now indicate that this isn't going to change very much, that this year what we're going to see is the UK economy slowing down to something like 1%. What is more distressing, and this is a point to which Adam alluded, is that investment performance, which really determines how quickly an economy is going to grow from a longer run point of view, that has really totally underperformed the rest of the G7. So you see the black line, the one at the bottom of the chart, that is Britain's performance, where you see that investment since June 2016 has totally flatlined at a time that the rest of the group are growing by something like 10%. So that's not a very good sign, and that's indicating the uncertainty associated with Brexit has really not been good for business confidence. The pound is the same kind of story. You've seen something like a 15% drop in the pound, and what you see as well is a total stagnation in wages. So let me go on to the second point that I want to mention. That is, there were certain illusions that were held by those advocating Brexit that experience seems to have shattered. The first was that Brexit would not involve any economic costs, and what my charts would suggest that it's already involved quite a lot of economic costs and makes a huge difference whether the economy is growing at 2-3% and whether it's growing at 1%. Another illusion that the Brexiteers held was that the UK held all of the cards in the negotiation, which is a little strange considering that the UK dependence on Europe for its trade is so much larger than the other way around. The UK, 50% of its trade is with Europe, whereas Europe, only something like 15% of their trade is with the UK. So just in terms of the leverage, the notion that the United Kingdom could have its cake and eat it didn't really pan out. The third was that the UK would take back economic control. Now, as I understand it, this withdrawal agreement would have Britain having to abide by the rules set by the Europeans in terms of the customs union for the next couple of years, and maybe they get locked in indefinitely, but they don't have a seat at the table. They're going to have to comply with the regulations if they want access to that market. So that is hardly the way in which you take back control. And then there's the point that Amanda referred to, is that trade deals are not really straightforward. They take a long time. And if you don't have the leverage, if you're rather desperate, you're not really going to get good terms. So the notion that you're going to get very easy terms from the United States is risible. Let me now just turn to what the prospects of the UK is after Brexit. There's no question in my mind that no-deal Brexit would be hugely destructive, because what you'd have is it would not only be disrupting trade flows, but it would really be interrupting supply chains. And if you've got something like 50% of your trade with Europe, that is going to be problematic. This chart just indicates that as much as 50% of the UK's trade is with the European Union, another big part, another 11% takes place with where the EU's got free trade agreements. So the dependence on Europe is pretty large. My view that the hard Brexit would really be destructive is very much shared by the Bank of England. And this chart really illustrates what their view is, that should you get a hard Brexit, you're going to get a drop in GDP, somewhere like 7%, which would be really a huge shock. Just think back to the recession in the United States, that we had nothing of that sort. This would be highly disruptive. But even in the case of a less disruptive, less disorderly departure, you get big output losses. The Bank of England is not alone. This chart is just indicating a variety of forecasters, including the IMF, the OECD, NISR. All of them are indicating that this would be a huge shock to the United Kingdom economy. I should also mention that what is of concern to me is that all of this is going to be occurring at a time that the UK is still very much dependent on the kindness of strangers to finance them, that they're running a current account deficit, something like 4% of GDP. It's not a good idea to have a very disruptive exit in those kind of circumstances. I would expect that the pound would really be clobbered, should we get the hard Brexit. The point I'd make is that even were we to have a soft Brexit, we're still going to have a lot of uncertainty for the next few years, because all that this stage is doing is it's the first part of the agreement. It's not telling us what the end point is. And I would argue that if we don't know what the end point is, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the investment community, very much as there's been uncertainty the last 2 years. So we're going to have a prolonged period of the United Kingdom economy underperforming as a result of low levels of investment for the next couple of years. The last point that I'd make is that Brexit is really not coming at a good time for Europe. We know that Italy is already in a recession. Italy's got high debt levels, it's got a poor banking system, it's got a dysfunctional political system. You really don't want to have the whole of Europe going into recession. It's difficult to see how they avoid a sovereign debt crisis if that's the case. Germany is on the cusp of a recession. It just narrowly avoided recession in the second half of last year. It's in a trade dispute with the United States. You could get a shock from that side. And France has got its problems with the Yellow Vest movement, with social unrest. So what I'm saying is that you've got all four major economies in Europe challenged. The last thing that Europe and the globe needs is to have a hard Brexit. And I would say that if you have a full-blown European crisis, there's no way that that is not going to reach our shores. So I very much disagree, with the point that Brexit isn't a major threat, and that's why I'm really hoping that some way is found to avoid the default position, which on April the 12th or whether it's May the 22nd occurs if the UK cannot get its act together and somehow get an agreement that would be acceptable to Europe.
Thank you, Desmond. I think I'd encourage the speakers first to talk amongst themselves a little bit in front of you, and then you can all ask questions after that. We'll do maybe 10 minutes of speakers talking. I'll just throw a couple of things to you and see what you have to say about it. I mean, firstly, Desmond, for all the economic information you present, Britain is still outperforming the Eurozone, not by much. What explains that? Why is employment going so well? I mean, I realise Brexit hasn't happened yet, but a lot of the catastrophe that we were told about would happen after the vote, not after Brexit, has not come to pass. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, no, I think that it's certainly true, and people who engage in Project Fear, really should be accountable that after the referendum, we really did not have the collapse that a lot of people were talking about.
Is everyone in the audience familiar with Project Fear? Roughly, yeah. It's the idea that the British government, it's not the idea, it's the truth actually, that the British government, that Cameron's government tried to intimidate voters by talking about all the catastrophic consequences of Brexit. And British voters, or the majority of them, just said sod off. So that's the
yeah, but I think that while there wasn't the collapse, I think the charts that I've been putting up, are illustrating that in many respects, the United Kingdom economy has not been a healthy economy, in the sense that if you've got investment that is totally flatlining, that is telling you something about where your future economy is going to be. So the fact that you've got high employment isn't that much comfort. If you're getting stagnation in terms of wages, that productivity is pretty low. I guess.
But that's a much bigger problem in the Eurozone, isn't it? Wage stagnation.
No, actually, it's not. The facts are that, with the exception of Italy, in the euro area, real wage growth has basically.
What's youth unemployment in Greece and Italy and Spain? I mean,
no, but you're talking. I think.
Oded, do you want to?
I think what Adam. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
What Adam is saying is certainly correct. That you really have to distinguish between the Southern European economies and the Northern European economies. So, for instance, like if you look at the way in which the German economy has been performing, that has been really been performing until very recently at a very respectable kind of pace. Both in terms of employment, in terms of growth, it's been really outperforming the UK. And the chart, that I put up was really showing the G7 countries that the United Kingdom has gone from the top of that league in terms of GDP growth, which I would take as the overall indication of how productive the economy is. It's gone from the best producing to the weakest.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about America too. I mean, Amanda, you talked about it a bit, and I'd like to ask Anthony too. It's often dismissed as a sort of Trumpist, Brexiteer fantasy that the UK and America could strike a beautiful free trade deal, and I'm sure there's a lot of daydreaming going on. But it seems to me slightly too cynical to say that there isn't the possibility of a very healthy trade relationship in the future after Brexit. Anthony, what do you say about that?
I think I had two thoughts, really. One, as I said in my remarks, I think, yes, we are committed to negotiating an FTA when we are able to do so, once we've left. And we have certainly welcomed the commitment from the US administration to begin making its own preparations. So we have been talking, we're not negotiating, we're not even scoping, because the US system doesn't have authority from Congress yet, and we're still working through our own processes. But we have something we call a Trade and Investment Working Group that has met 5 times since July 2017, when it was set up by my Secretary of State Liam Fox and Ambassador Lighthizer. And that has done a number of things, including talking to each other about what a trade agreement might look like. But as I say, we're not negotiating yet. But I think the point I'd emphasise is that I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, in the context of everything else that is happening in the world, either in the global economy or the bilateral relationship between the UK and the EU, UK and the US, and indeed the EU-US, because I think that's an important part of the context. The question we should be asking ourselves is, where can we deepen and strengthen what is already a quite remarkable economic relationship between the US and the UK? What are the sectors that are going to drive future jobs, growth and economic security in both our countries, whether it's financial services, life sciences, AI, creative industries, advanced manufacturing, et cetera, and then answer the question, how do you deepen and strengthen? And I think you come up with a menu that includes things that we could negotiate through an FTA, but not only. So our two treasuries set up a regulatory working group in March last year, for example. So that's another part of the way we have the discussion. So that is how I think we should frame it. That is absolutely, I mean, let me be very candid about one thing. That's not to dismiss a lot of what some of the other panellists have said about the challenges and the headwinds. Not all, in my humble opinion, are the result of Brexit. So the slide here, we talk about US trade policy, and we certainly have our view on the prospect of auto tariffs. We think they would be very severe. And just like the steel and aluminium tariffs, we reject the notion that they are justified by national security concerns. So, this is a complex dynamic that we're operating in.
It's often said that we're really short. It's said a couple of times here that we're really short-staffed in terms of trade negotiators. Is that true?
So I absolutely agree with the way it was framed, which is we don't have legions of trade negotiators, because I think the British taxpayer would have asked the question why we had them while we were members of the EU. But I do believe that we have moved fast to build a trade policy capability in the UK within the Department for International Trade. I do believe that in terms of the other, I mean, as I observe what the American system has in terms of its trade negotiating capability, which I think is pretty high end. Yes, there are negotiators, but you also have policy experts, lawyers, economists, policymakers, etc. We've got quite a lot of those. It's called the British Civil Service. I also don't agree, if I may, that the majority of the British Civil Service has been switched on to contingency planning. There is still quite a lot of resource, in my view, in the British Civil Service to conduct this agenda. If I made just one other comment, and I say this obviously as a civil servant, and I've been sort of in the middle of this ever since the beginning. I was in the Cabinet Office at the time of the referendum. We got turned into the Department for Exiting the EU by the Prime Minister in the middle of July 2016. This point about Project Fear, I don't agree that it was Project Fear. The white paper that we put out actually had on the front the best of both worlds.
Yeah, but you were never going to call it Project Fear.
There was a campaign that was conducted. There was a campaign that was conducted that either side have now, since then, in my view, in hindsight, sort of assessed it and described it in certain terms. I actually think the key thing we need to do now is sort of get beyond the terminology and get beyond some of the sort of the simplistic sort of argument in this, focus on what is the right deal for the UK and the EU, including, of course, around crucial issues like the Irish border, work out how we do this, and then carry it out.
Could I just add that, aside from the question of future UK-US trading relations, there's also, of course, the wider question of the transatlantic trading relationship. After all, the transatlantic economy, including the UK, of course, accounts for nearly half of global GDP and 1/3 of trade flows, more than half of foreign direct investment flows. So, while of course it's true that the UK and the US, will be able to negotiate a trade deal, the European Union will also be looking to negotiate a trade deal with the United States, as we've done with Japan recently and with Canada not long ago. And those trade deals and other ones are underway as well, will, I think, deliver further boosts to the European Union's trading position in the world. So it's not exclusively a matter of looking at the future of EU, of UK-US. You also need to look at the overall transatlantic economic relationship, which is so important and will continue to be important in the future. And frankly, the things that divide Europeans and Americans on trade are fairly trivial compared with the overlapping interests we have, and particularly the flow of investment in both directions, where most foreign investment in the United States comes from the European Union. I mean, Ireland, with 5 million people, is one of the top 10 foreign direct investors in the United States. Has more direct investment here than many much larger countries.
Could I just add on my point with this? I mean, I certainly think it's possible that the two sides can negotiate a free trade agreement. My point simply was that it's not going to be quick and it's not going to be easy, and how beautiful it is in the eye of the beholder. But the one additional point that I would make is any free trade agreement is going to have to be ratified by Congress. And there's very strong support for Ireland and for the peace process in Congress. And you're already seeing comments, including made by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Richie O'Neill, with a strong Irish background, suggesting that Congress is not going to ratify any free trade agreement that is made on the back of the decimation of the Northern Ireland peace process. And so if you do end up having a hard Brexit and a hard border in Northern Ireland, there is not going to be support in Congress for a trade deal that ends up causing disruption on the island of Ireland.
Desmond, you want to say something?
No, but I just thought in terms of the trade agreement that there's several problems from the UK point of view. One is these agreements take a long time to negotiate. Secondly, it's not just a trade agreement that the United Kingdom is going to be negotiating with the United States, but once it leaves Europe, all of those trade agreements that Europe had with these different countries, presumably the United Kingdom is going to have to do that again. And the third point I'd make is just in terms of all of those negotiations, it would seem to me that the leverage in those negotiations that the United Kingdom has is very small in relation to that of their trade partners who are in no particular hurry. The United Kingdom, for instance, in dealing with the United States, I would think that it's rather wishful thinking on the part of the United Kingdom to think that they're going to get very easy terms from the United States and they're not going to have to open up to agriculture and things of that sort.
Shall we open up questions to the floor? That gentleman, you were the first to put your hand up. You.
No.
Do we have a microphone? You've got a very loud voice. I think you can go for it.
About an hour, about 110 minutes ago, Theresa May announced that she was going to be Prime Minister, specifically that she will resign before the next phase of the Brexit talks.
Has she announced that, or has someone announced that for her? I'm not sure.
The news says that she announced
We don't know in
will resign before the next phase of the Brexit talks. So my question to the panel is, what is your assessment of the potential impact of this announcement that May made just a couple hours ago?
Well, let's start with you, Adam. You want to answer that?
Little to none, because sometimes personalities and individuals matter a lot. But the fundamental issue right now in terms of decision-making about Brexit is the combination of two facts. First, one which Theresa May has rightly said and which Her Majesty's representative mentioned, which is the EU has basically put forward its best offer on the withdrawal deal. They can change the date if there's some major thing like a general election or a referendum, but basically there's no wiggle room from the EU. So the Parliament will have the same set of choices to vote on. And second, I would argue the issue has been that the parties themselves, the two major parties in the British system, are very heavily split internally, each one. And the removal of May does not mean either Boris Johnson or Oliver Letton come in with a huge majority suddenly in a unified party. So to me, unfortunately, I don't think it makes much difference.
Amanda, you talked about May's mistakes. I mean, in phase two, presumably, she could, without May, you could have a more effective leader at negotiating and dealing with the European Union. I think it's fair to say she hasn't been very effective.
True. I mean, I would say two things. I mean, one, unless May has actually come out since we've been on this panel, what I saw about an hour and a half ago was Theresa May had a meeting with backbenchers who were briefing out to the press what she had said. I think Theresa May is hoping to bring the deal back for a third time and is desperately trying to get members of her party on board to support it the third time. She needs to flip 75 Conservative MPs or get a large number of Labour MPs to support the deal. So whether or not a gambit by indicating that she would not lead the party into the second phase of this process is going to be enough to flip people remains to be seen. I mean, I think Adam is right that the fundamental challenge remains, which is that you have a divide within the parties, within the parliament, and within the country itself about what sort of relationship the UK ultimately wants with the European Union. The withdrawal agreement is where the debate has focused on because of the backstop, which is what says that if this does not get sorted out in the future, the UK would need to remain in the customs union. From the European Union's perspective, all options are open still going forward in the political discussions about what the future relationship looks like. But the UK ultimately is going to continue to be confronted by the same set of questions, and I think is going to continue to wrestle with the same sort of difficulties over or not how close they want that alignment to be. The one thing I think Adam didn't mention in the talk about Norway Plus is that the UK would have to allow free movement of people as part of agreement to the four freedoms of goods, services, capital, and people. And one of the other things that motivated the Brexit referendum was a desire for the UK to have control of its borders. I think this was fueled by a lot of the images from the 2015 migration crisis with Syrian refugees and others coming over. But really what made this much more concerning for people in the UK was the proverbial Polish plumber and people from Central and Eastern Europe who were coming. And so there is going to need to be a decision on that. And I think Adam is right that even if you have a different leader in the Conservative Party who might structure those negotiations in a slightly different way, the same fundamental set of questions is going to remain.
Desmond,
I
you
won't
want to
expect
say
you to comment on this, but I will, because what I think we've learned from the last few years is that this is a much more difficult process than anybody imagined in advance, right? And by the way, the next phase will be even more difficult again, because this is like reverse engineering your membership of the European Union. Yeah. Typically, when a country applies to join the European Union, there are 30 separate chapters that have to be negotiated. Now, you don't have to negotiate all of those on your way out, but certainly most of them will have to be looked into, and that's going to be a terribly complex process. So, you see, normally in the European Union, when you have an issue that arises, it's happened before, and therefore, for example, every 5 or 7 years we have the multilateral financial framework, the budget of the EU for the following period of time. And that's a difficult business, as you can imagine, to work out. It takes a year and a half to work it out. But we've always got a blueprint that it's happened before, and we know how it was done the last time, and we use that as a blueprint, and eventually we get there. This time, there was no blueprint for this, and there'll be no blueprint for the next phase either, because no one has ever tried to do this before. And the other point I would make is that a negotiating position of any government is strong to the extent to which you have a unified government and a unified parliament behind you. The reason that our government can act decisively on this issue is because they have almost universal support in our parliament, that nobody in the parliament is pulling and saying we should leave or we should take a different view. So that's why, of course, it's been difficult, I think, for the British government over the last 3 years, is because there have been obvious divisions within the country and within parliament, and that never makes for an easy negotiating process.
We'll go back to questions, but Desmond, you want to say something quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly, I would think that her resignation could have real consequences for the second stage of the negotiation period that we're going to go into now once the deal is approved. Because if she has offered to step down in favor, it depends who takes her place. You know, if you've got a hard Brexiteer driving the negotiations in the second round, that is likely to create a lot more investor uncertainty than if you've got somebody who is going to be very moderate, because that'll influence how you think the end point is going to be. So I don't think it's not without consequence.
This lady here in the very fetching scarf.
May I speak? May I have your permission to make a couple of comments as a former British Member of Parliament
Of course.
before I go on to ask a question? I'm sorry about that. I don't usually take such licence. First of all, Scottish devolution was not the result of the Blair government. It was of the Labour government of the late 70s, following the discovery of North Sea oil, which led to the first Scottish devolution bill, largely because Scottish Labour MPs feared the competition from Scottish nationalist MPs. Secondly, Scotland is, to quite a large extent, maintained by a special subvention from the British government called the Barnett Formula, which amounts to about £1,600 per head of the Scottish population, which I think influenced their views to a large extent in the last referendum. Secondly, if Mrs. May were to step down, this I gather is a hypothetical issue, but if she did, then I think it is unlikely that Parliament would accept the second change in the party leadership and therefore of the Prime Minister. I think there would be enormous pressures in Parliament for a general election, apart from the distraction of electing another leader of the Conservative Party to become the Prime Minister. So I think there are those couple of comments I'd like to throw into the pot, as it were. The third point is the question that I wanted to pose to you before I heard some additional comments. It seems to me that a no-Brexit deal is more of an illusion than a reality, because if the British if British companies offering goods and services to the rest of the European Union were to do so successfully, they would actually have to meet the regulations of the rest of the EU, otherwise face delays before the establishment of the single market. Some member states of the European Union then were adept at using rules, regulations, and bureaucratic delays to impede the importing of goods from the UK. I think, therefore, if Britain still wanted to export goods and services, including especially financial services, to the rest of the European Union, they would find that, as a matter of fact, that they would have to comply with numerous regulations and rules already promulgated by the European Union, and I think that that would create enormous difficulties.
What do you say about that? Who would like Adam? No deal is an illusion.
I think the honourable member from wherever she was from, thank you, I think is right in that no deal without economic costs is an illusion. If you this is why I said I think it's not a stable equilibrium. Either you go for as much adherence, and I think Amanda was making the same point. You go for as much adherence as possible for the reasons you said, or else you really think your destiny is completely something else. You really want to shift your economy. And as has been pointed out, my friend Jonathan Portis at King's College London is one of the people who's been writing about this. He's not alone by any means. It would require an incredibly interventionist UK government to force many of the changes that would be required to enforce having enough labor if you're not allowing free movement of people, changing regulations. You have to create all these regulations. You have to do a whole bunch of stuff. And so I agree with her. I agree with the honourable lady. No Brexit or hard Brexit doesn't really make sense, because you're not going to get the freedom, you're not going to get the Singapore on the Thames no matter what you do, because in the end they'll either have to conform to the EU or they're going to have to do some really interventionist stuff at home.
Yeah, the only difference is that you won't have a seat at the table. You'll have to abide by the regulations, but without a seat at the table.
Again, Amanda's right that I glossed over the immigration issue, the migration issue. But leaving that aside, again, so is Brexit about economics or is Brexit about political will? If it's about economics, there's essentially no way to square the circle, as all of us essentially have said, even though the gentleman who has to try will try. But if it's about politics, and you can say this is about freedom, this is about not being part of being under Brussels, this is not about, then the not having a say is just a commercial thing. You know, if I want my businesses to export to Belgium the same way as to export to Japan, I have to go through some hassle and some costs to reach that market. But it's not a political thing anymore, it's just a business thing.
Anthony, do you ever think that Brexit is a kind of mirage, really? I mean, it's a piece of direct democracy that parliamentary democracy just cannot compute.
I feel bound to say that I would offer an observation rather than a comment as an official representative of the United States government. But no, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I think, you know, at one level it's an extraordinary moment at many levels that are all happening and interacting with each other. I think I would personally observe that the referendum itself was essentially a political moment. I think it was a manifestation of a whole host of different sort of tensions and dynamics within the British political system, and indeed Britain's relationship with both its European partners and indeed its sense of identity in the rest of the world. And what we got was a 52-48 decision by the people to leave, and what we have had since then is a government doing what I think is the only thing a British government could do in those circumstances, which is trying to make manifest that decision. And what you have is a civil service and a civil servant in front of you who serves the government of the day and is looking to support that wherever we can. The question about, you know, the Prime Minister, I mean, this has been sort of bubbling around in the debate for a while. I mean, I again would just observe, if this means that there is a body of MPs who are now prepared to support the withdrawal agreement, then I think it's hugely significant. Does it change the way that the EU will negotiate with us in the next phase? No, in my view, because they will negotiate from their set of negotiating priorities. And the British government will move into a phase of negotiating on the back of a withdrawal agreement, which is a legal text and a legal commitment to the EU, with a view to reaching a future partnership. And it will move into that next phase, which itself will be dynamic and equally affected by political, economic consequences.
It's just so strange that she has to fire herself to get her own deal through.
Well, it's
I think that's where I plead the fifth.
It's so strange that should matter to people, because, you know, it's a fundamental issue for the future of Britain.
Well, I think.
And why should it matter to the MPs who, you know, the internal party politics, unless what you're saying is really, therefore we're going to renege on the withdrawal agreement in some way or screw up the political determination later, because otherwise, what's the point?
Right. This gentleman in the berry.
Prime Minister May's comment. You made reference to Prime Minister May's comment that having a second referendum would be undemocratic. I can understand why she would say that for a political matter, but why is it conceptually undemocratic, where we've learned from our speakers how much has changed in the last 3 years, so that and a parliament can make changes when it's acting as a parliament, but why shouldn't the public in another referendum have an opportunity to take into account all of the changes, and why is that undemocratic?
I don't think I did. If I did comment on that, I didn't mean to. I basically think that is the position of the government. That's the position I represent. I again observed that one of the dynamics that will play out in the indicative votes in Parliament today will go to that issue, and we'll need to see what Parliament says and what that means for the position of the government. I've confessed that probably doesn't answer your question, but that, I'm afraid, is all I can say.
As one not bound by a government position, I'll add a few things on the challenge of the referendum. I mean, the initial problem is there's simply no support in Parliament for it. I mean, the opposition parties are supportive of a referendum. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, is lukewarm supportive. He's a lifelong Eurosceptic. His position has always been it would be better to have a general election that leads to him as Prime Minister so he can negotiate a better deal, but has grudgingly supported it. And you've even got 10 Conservative MPs that would be willing to vote in favor of it. The problem is you've got about 20 to 40 Labour MPs that represent constituencies that support Brexit, and so their votes would cancel out anything coming from the Conservative side. So one problem, and I guess we'll see what happens in the votes this afternoon, but there haven't been the numbers. The second is it would be enormously complicated. I mean, Parliament would have to legislate for a referendum. It took them 7 months to pass the legislation for the referendum the first time around, and most importantly, Parliament would have to agree on the question. And given that Parliament can't agree on what it wants, it would be a little bit difficult to come up with the question. There's been discussions about whether you have rerun the initial referendum, yes, no. And if you look at opinion polls, most people do not want a rerun, yes, no. There's also been talk put forward by the Labour Party of having a confirmatory referendum that they will support Theresa May's deal if it is then put to the public in terms of a referendum to support that. There's a bit more support for this idea of a people's vote. The final issue was that opinion polls do not show a significant swing in perspective. There is a change by a couple of points, and it looks likely that Remain would win, but you potentially could be 52-48 the other way, maybe 55, so not significantly. So there is a risk, and you could argue this, in democratic terms, of having a significantly pissed off percentage of your population just in the other direction, and what does that then do to populist movements on the other side? So I'm personally sympathetic to the emotional appeal of it, but I don't think it's without risk.
But you can
We've twice had a second.
You can take comfort that while they're not going to have a second referendum, they keep voting on the same proposal a number of times.
I mean, we've twice had a second referendum on a European treaty, but the key difference for us is that we have a written constitution. So every time we have a referendum, the referendum is designed to agree the wording that goes into our constitution. So, and on a couple of occasions, and also, by the way, we have a way of doing referendums because we do them so relatively frequently, because we have a written constitution, that comes with the territory, and the people are sovereign when it comes to changing the constitution. But we establish a referendum commission, which is chaired by a High Court judge. And the purpose of that commission is to produce neutral, value-free, politically unbiased information for the public about the issues that are being dealt with in the referendum. And that's why I think we've had some quite successful experience with referendums. We had the marriage equality referendum in 2015, where the public voted 62-38 to allow marriage equality in our constitution. And then we had one on abortion last year, which was, that issue is very divisive, and it's very difficult in every country. It's a difficult topic. But again, the public voted decisively to change our constitution to allow for abortion in certain circumstances. But the key reason why we can have a second referendum is because we can get a vote in our parliament, because 85% or more of our parliamentarians are pro-European, and therefore they are inclined, if there's a good reason, if there's a good argument put forward for having a second referendum, they're inclined to agree and to go along with that. And it wasn't easy to get. I was the European director of our foreign ministry at the time of the two referendums we had on the Lisbon Treaty, and it wasn't easy to get from a situation where the first referendum resulted in a no vote to having a second referendum, which was a decisive yes. There was a process that had to be gone through, but ultimately it was approved by our Parliament, and the Parliament had the right to call a second referendum, and it did so. And obviously that's a problem that would be much more difficult to resolve in Britain at the moment.
Hang on, this gentleman at the front.
This is not will or would, but should the EU give Britain control of its borders vis-a-vis migration?
Who should answer that one? Anthony.
Yes, I think will, should, and has. In a way, this issue. I would emphasise 2 points. We have control of our borders now. The question is what our future relationship is under free movement. And I share the observation that's been made that it's a pretty clear position of the British government not to have freedom of movement. That obviously then has implications for the range of options available to us in the future partnership, and we'll see how that plays out. But I also would just really emphasise the point that Daniel made about the importance of the UK-Ireland relationship and the maintenance of the common travel area. As I said, before I did this current job, I was in the Brexit department, and I think that was actually one of the earliest agreements that we reached. And while we reached it with the European Commission negotiating on behalf of the EU, it came as a result of a very sort of intensive and quick dialogue between London and Dublin. And it's a reflection, I think, maybe of the final point I'd make, which is the common travel area predated both of our memberships of the EEC, then the EU. And the context in which we conduct our relationships, whether with the EU, whether with Ireland, whether with the US, it's not been static. It's been obviously heavily conditioned by the context of our European Union membership for the last 40-odd years. And that context is about to change. But,
we should probably speed up through the questions a little bit. This lady here.
Thank you. My question is, how do you think the impact of Brexit on the relations between China and the UK? Since the EU are already big partners with China on trade, and they are also strengthening work on other issues like climate change. So on leaving the EU, is the UK going to try to build closer bilateral relationships with China, or it will sort of give way to EU to leave way to EU to work with China more extensively?
The risk of being slightly simplistic, I don't think it fundamentally affects our ambitions for our relationship with China. I think you look back over our governments of the last sort of 10 to 15 years. I worked in Number 10 with Tony Blair. He was very committed to a close relationship between the UK and China. David Cameron and George Osborne were very committed to a close relationship. We did it from within our European membership. What leaving the EU will give us potentially is greater individual control of how that is manifested in particular agreements. But I personally don't think it fundamentally changes the direction of travel. So no, I don't think it changes it fundamentally.
Can I just make one very quick point? There is a risk. I don't by any means think inevitable, but there is a risk that a UK, if it suffers from the economic harms that Desmond and Amanda and I have referred to, it tries to get back investment by doing what some people would call a race to the bottom. And this could show up very much in the China-UK relationship, that they, for example, have much less scrutiny of technology investments than, say, the US has now put in and a number of NATO allies in Australia and Japan are putting it. That they, as they already arguably have done in certain areas, that they turn a blind eye to issues of financial transactions, let's say, that would not be entirely salutary or clean. The UK could end up under either party going down that road as a desperation measure, and that might end up making them much closer to China, but probably not in a way that most UK people would like.
Can I just comment on, sorry, I feel I ought to comment on that.
Of course you do.
I mean, first of all, I think our ministers actually of varying, where they are on sort of the spectrum of Brexiter, have all made clear that we have no intention of engaging in a race to the bottom. I think we have been fully part of European conversations, not reluctantly, but I think we've led some of them around scrutiny of incoming investment, not just from China, but from that are important for our critical national infrastructure. And as was, I think you observed earlier, we are going to be still very closely influenced by our relationship with the EU and indeed with the US, which I think is going to be the context in which we will pursue our relationship with other countries in the world. So I don't think it's going to be sort of that, and I'm not saying you said it was that binary, but I wouldn't assume...
It would be quite funny if the government policy was race to the bottom. That would be quite an achievement. This gentleman here had a question. Sorry, okay. You've been waiting for a long time? Okay. You've been waiting, okay. Yep, you.
Should I go ahead?
Go for it.
Just as somebody who's followed this for quite some time, given the split within the parliament and within the populace itself, Can you explain why there isn't more discussion of maybe a special autonomous region or something to that effect, so that it's not one size fits all sort of solution, but it's more so, hey, for the folks who wanted Brexit, we've now got Brexitania essentially, and you go off and do whatever it is that you want to do, and we'll see how that works out. And for everybody else who wanted to remain, they just kind of try that and see how that works out.
What are you saying? Sorry, create alternate realities?
No, a special autonomous region. So essentially, rather than having a conversation about whether all of UK breaks off, having a discussion about, well, just split it. And so the people who want control over their own borders and whatever else, they try that and they see how that works out, and everybody can kind of learn from that example.
It's beautifully weird. Who would like?
I mean,
Amanda, I think
essentially Hong Kong and Macau and a number of other places.
Amanda, I think that's one for you.
Well, I mean, the biggest fundamental problem with that is, you could have people living in the same house who have different perspectives and voted in different ways, and so you can't create special autonomous zones for two people living in the same household or the same community. You have a deeply divided society. I think, and this is part of the point that I was making, is that it is possible that you could end up having the effects and the different opinions on Brexit playing out in different ways, particularly in Scotland, if they do decide to go independent after a number of years because they're unhappy being outside the European Union, which is something they would prefer to do. And there's also the possibility, although I don't think it's likely in the near term, of constitutional change in Northern Ireland, where you could end up having a border poll and asking people in Northern Ireland if they would prefer to be part of Ireland within the European Union rather than to remain within the United Kingdom. So I do think that Brexit could end up leading to changes in the UK's constitutional status as a result of Brexit, but I don't think there's any practical way for the UK to have multiple trade and border policies.
Any more? Did you have a question in the green jumper? Yeah. Sorry, you stuck your hand up a while ago.
Thank you. I guess
we'll do two more after this. Sorry.
This one might be for Adam, I think. Could you speak specifically about what the impact you think would be on London, specifically its status as a global financial center? Because you use the example of the auto manufacturers who, in the northern parts have said they will move. Do you see examples of perhaps your JP Morgans, Goldman Sachs, etc., relocating to a Dublin or Frankfurt? What will London be to wear the impact, or do you think there'll be a material deterioration in its status?
I'll try to be swift. There are actually a lot of serious studies directly on this point. My colleague Nicholas Varone from Peterson Institute's done some of the work. There are others who've done it. Roughly, the consensus is that about 25 to 30% of employment in the city will move elsewhere, and much of it has already begun to move. So Dublin has picked up some. Paris has picked up a surprising amount. Frankfurt has picked up a surprisingly small amount. We can get into the psyche of bankers why that's the case. Most of what's moving so far is some of the lower value-added things. So it's bond issuance. It's going to be the euro area, once the UK is out, has committed to moving certain clearing operations having to do in euro transactions that it has to take place in Europe rather than London. So again, it's a larger hit than one-for-one with, say, overall trade or GDP. But the City of London has been a global financial center for decades, if not centuries off and on. And the collection of human capital that's there and the investments are there will remain to some degree. It's just going to shrink. It's going to be less dominant in Europe than it was, is pretty much the consensus view.
I'm very sorry, we've run out of time, but thank you all for your questions and for listening. And thank you to the AEI and our excellent speakers.
Thank you.
And also Boris Johnson has just decided that he's backed. He's just come out and said he's backing Theresa May's deal. So
oh my God.
Maybe it was the power of your discussion somehow.